Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Dave Rodriguez Fuentes. Most people call me D-Rod, so feel free to call me D-Rod. Let's get started. I'd like to start with a little bit about me. I'm just a web developer and interpret pursuits. However, we recently got acquired, so I guess technically since the beginning of this month, I'm not now an Accenture employee. So before that, I was an instructor at Launch Academy, a programming boot camp. There I wrote the first version of the React curriculum. I think it's been rewritten a couple times now, and now it's like super awesome. Good place to look for junior developers. I also enjoy sailing in the summer, skiing in the winter, and salsa dancing with my girlfriend like all year long. She's here even though she doesn't understand any code, so thanks. Also a big fan of Boston sports team. Go Pats. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Why is React so awesome? It's because we can compose really complex UIs together. Usually, we have this huge page, a lot of things going on, but usually we can just break it down to little components. Each handles its own state, and hence we break a big problem into smaller little problems. And that's really great. We can also reuse these components over and over again throughout our whole app. Great. So I've been doing this, and it's been going really well, but eventually I do break it down to little smaller components. However, eventually I run into the problem of like, oh, I feel like I'm running the same state over and over again, even in my really small components. So how do I get around that? First, I'm just going to go through a couple like very simple components, and then we'll get into how to solve that. So here we have a button component. We can see here that we have essentially some Boolean state. And this delete button component, essentially it's an are you sure kind of modal confirm. So when you click on the button, pop-up shows up and it's like, are you really sure you want to delete this? You click yes or no. Awesome. The important thing here is the Boolean state is modal open, starts out false, and you get two little handlers, close modal and open modal. And some other things that are specific to this component. Great. So here's a little live demo. I think this works. Yeah. Oh, no. It's funny because it works in my presenter thing. So if I have to go over here and I think I need to click it, great, excellent. But now I need to navigate it back. Great, awesome. Spectacle is really cool. Half this the hardest thing about this presentation was writing the presentation on Spectacle, but totally worth it. So that's really it. That's all it does. You click it. You say yes or no. Awesome. All right. So I keep on building my app. Eventually, I come upon another component, a pop-up component. This one doesn't actually have any UI to initiate the modal per se. We have a little component that mount, and it still has the same state of is modal open, false, two handlers to close or open. But essentially, once the component lands, in 2 seconds, it will just turn on, and it will show the modal, and it'll annoy you a bunch. There's no demo of this one because it was really annoying, so I just took it out. All right, and finally, we have here are two components side by side. Just to show, like, hey, I have the same state here. I'm essentially doing the same handlers, right? Like, this is not terrible. This is very, like, simple UI and sure. But, like, I don't know. I saw this pattern over and over again every time I did a modal. And then later on, I even just saw a lot of Boolean state. So I was kind of like replicating the same two handlers in the same state, just with different names over and over again. So I thought there has to be a way to like encapsulate this logic a little bit. Here's a question. Anybody who knows, what technique can we use here to refactor the shared component logic?
Inheritance.
Inheritance, that's correct. No, higher order components is the right answer. Great. Before getting into that, I just want to do a quick review of higher order functions, because higher components are a subset of higher order functions. So a higher order function is simply a function that receives a function as an argument. Usually these are called like callback functions. or returns a function, can do both also. We're going to focus on the fact that a function that returns a function. So here's a nice quick example of create add number. We could have created two simple functions, one add2, like x returns x plus 2, and then another one that is add3 x plus x equals x plus 3. But again, there's repetition there. Really, the variable there is the constant that's being added. So we can create a higher order function to essentially just create these. It's a factory that will create these functions of add constant. So here we can see how it's being used. It's really great. Cool. So higher order functions are functions that return functions. Higher order component is a function that takes a component and returns a new component. Cool. So this is a special type of higher order function. So here's an example. At the very top, we see normal component definition. I call it toJSON. Receives props. All this component definition does is literally just kind of like displays the props on the page, just stringifies them, formats them really nicely. It's a nice little helper component to see what data is like being rendered. And now I'm going to create another, a higher order component. Here we can see it takes base component as argument. This can be any component definition. And then we return another component definition. So here we can see in the return, we see props and then like begin the function. So that just looks like a component definition, right? And what we're doing here, we're just grabbing the current count from the props, adding 1 to it. I'm also just going to inject date, just with the current date time. So basically, I'm going to grab this base component, wrap it in a new component, and just add some new props that will be passed down to the base component. In the bottom, this get cut. Okay, no. And then in the very bottom, I have like an app component. I'm just going to show like, hey, what's the JSON component look like with count equals 0, and what does this enhanced JSON component look like with count equals 0. So here's another fun little demo. Yeah, I think you can still see it just okay. So we can see on the top we have the normal toJSON component. I just gave it count 0, great, as expected, just shows the props. Enhanced toJSON component, that's really just two components. Again, one that's wrapping it and like modifying the props, and then it renders JSON component with like the modified / injected props. So this is great because this is a place for us to essentially do work and logic in. All right, going back to our problem at hand, we have same state, same handlers in both of them. Theoretically, we can write a higher order component here to get rid of this and just encapsulate everything. So I'm going to create an add modal props higher order function, higher order component. Here on the left, I am, again, just receive a base component and now return class extends component. Remember that class is really just syntactic sugar. It's just still a function. I'm returning a function component definition here. And I'm returning a component definition with the logic that's been shared. So here we can see the isModal open false and the closed modal open modal handlers. The last key thing here is I have to I have to return the base component, but now I'm going to pass through any props that I received plus the additional shared logic handlers in current state, essentially. Cool. And then in the right, I can see how it's being used. Essentially, I refactored my component, took out that shared logic. In the very bottom, I'm using now my, it's a little hidden, so I'm going to try to -1 here. There we go. In the very bottom there, I'm using my higher order component to just use my original component and create this enhanced component. Cool. And again, just to show it still works. The same code. No, go back. Great. Still looks awesome. Cool. So, hooray, we did it. Sure. Cool. Looks good. So we got rid of that shared logic. we can do the same thing for the pop-up component. We can go back, pick out that shared logic, and then just wrap it in a higher order component. But I'll leave that for as an exercise. Anyways, all right, cool. So we have our, actually at this point, any questions before we get more into the weeds? Yes?
What happens if you have a conflict between properties, stuff in between those?
Yeah, definitely. So that's definitely something that you should know as you're composing functions. Like, what what props are injected generally? So here, if we just go back really quick, I'm passing through the props. However, is modal open, close modal, and open modal are going to take priority. So you got to know, like, what's this higher component injecting in props, right? It will overwrite what's been there previously. You can obviously create higher order components that have different behaviors, such as like, oh, if it's not given, then supply it. Otherwise, allow the one that's been set there to pass through. We'll go through some examples of those later. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Let's get back here. All right. So we created this add modal props higher component. It's really great. However, we really need to do two other things to really make it like, I don't know, production ready, I would say, is need to set display name. I guess the second one I would say is more optional, but it's very, I don't know, it's very common for higher components to be optimized, since theoretically you're going to be using them over and over again. Like all the big libraries like Redux and like Redux, the connect function, like that's highly optimized. It's just good general thing you want to do. However, I'd rather just use Recompose because I'm lazy. And that already has like really nice functions that will optimize my higher order components that I create. So, all right. Let's just talk about Recompose really quick. It's made by Andrew Clark. He's the co-author of Redux. From the README, it's a React utility built function for components and higher order components. Really, it just has functions to easily create higher order components and to work with them. So let's go ahead and use it. All right, so we're going to refactor this guy to use this with state handlers function from Recompose. So in the left, we have our original higher order component. And now with Recompose on the right, using with state handlers, we can see we're getting at the core of the functionality, which is like, oh, the first argument is an object for initial state. Optionally, you can pass in a function if you need to set the initial state via some props. And then the second argument is an object with handlers, essentially. These are slightly different from what we had in our higher order component originally. These take in higher order functions again. This allows you to essentially create handlers that will respond to the current state, the props, and also if, for example, you're typing into a text field, you can also hook into the event handler from the final function that's returned. But yeah, other than that, like the similarity, you can clearly see the similarity and how it translates. And you use it the same. You just grab a base component, wrap it in the higher order component, you're good to go. All right. So cool. We have like these higher order components, and we can modularize them. That's really hard to say. And we're off to the races, right? However, let's say I want to use a bunch of other higher order components from other libraries, such as React Router or the Connect from Redux. So here's an example of me using it. And here in the bottom, we have this very gross looking thing. Here it is again. It's awesome, very readable, right? Not really. It's the worst. So this is honestly another reason why I was like, I know that higher components are the answer, but like I feel like I shouldn't be using them because then this thing happens. But then somebody showed me, most people get around this by using compose function, and this actually comes in Recompose, but this also comes in the Redux library. Also, it's in Lodash and all that good stuff. generally functional programming utility function. So here we can see in the very bottom, this is how we would use Compose. Here we can see the 3 hierarchical components that we're using. And what's really nice about this that I really like is it visualizes really well like how the components are ordered. So we have with router in the very outer shell. Then underneath that we have connect. And then we have add props. And then at the very end we have our base component that we wanted to decorate essentially. So cool. Again, another quick way to think about this is like I just want to grab all my hierarchical components and make them into one that I can just use on my base component. So that's really awesome. And you can see I also threw in the previous example that's really gross, just to see before and after comparison. Cool. So we have hierarchical components, and we can combine them together to make more complex behaviors. Awesome. Let's look into some other hierarchical components that come in Recompose. There also comes a lifecycle hierarchical component. Here, all it does is essentially we give an object, and then with methods that are essentially like the lifecycle methods. So we can see here in the middle we have component did mount, and this goes back. What am I? Sorry. Let's see what am I doing here? Oh, I have a count 1. Right. I have a count 1 component. I switch it up a little bit. So I just want to say like, hey, set the count initially to 1. I want a handler with add 1, and now I also want the lifecycle hierarchical component that essentially just adds 1 after 2 seconds. Cool. I'm going to combine these hierarchical components together into one enhance function, and then I'm going to finally enhance my count component at the very bottom. Nice and lean functional component. Cool. Let's see what this looks like. So take 0 and 1. Great. Excellent. That's it. So cool. Yes.
So if your component wasn't simple, had another component did mount, what would happen?
If my they would both go. So essentially, you're here at the end of the day. You essentially have 3 components. So you have the with state handlers outer component. Then you have your like nice lifecycle component, which is kind of like an empty component, which is life cycles and just renders the next thing. And then you would have the final count component with a life cycle if you did it, essentially. Cool. So this is cool, but like, why would you do this? Like, you could theoretically get rid of this other higher component and just go straight to a class count component, right? And that's totally valid. Here, I'm just gonna set up the scenario where, cool, we're at this pop-up component again, circling back, and this one does have a component mount, and I don't know, because our product is really evil and our PM doesn't care. We're putting pop-ups in every page and they're all different. So like, I'm actually doing this very frequently, like essentially these 2 functions of like booleans, add props, and like also this component mount right away. So I can refactor this pop-up component. Now this is the enhanced pop-up component. We can see we have with state handlers, again, going back to our boolean is mul open, and then the nice lifecycle hierarchical component, and we're combining them into a single enhanced component. And what's really great is now I can just pump out like many different pop-up components by just writing more functional components, and I can just use the same enhance function. So like I don't have to constantly write component mount over and over and over again. Again, at the end of the day, this is more of like, if you see this repetition, like this is a nice way to abstract it. I can tell my junior developers, hey, just enhance it, add these 2 higher components, and you're done, essentially. Cool. Questions on this? Solid. All right. Oh, and then our PM comes back, or our product person comes back and is like, this is really great, but now I want pop-ups that, come in at different times. So not at 2 seconds, but like, I want this one at 1 second, and this one 5 seconds, and this one like 70 seconds. other crazy things. So clearly our lifecycle component here won't cut it. We need to generalize it a little bit more. So here we have it again on the left. And we can just do a very simple change. We can now essentially make a function that will create this higher component thing. Now we just give it the delay that we actually want, and now we can easily, in our compose chain, we can exactly tell it, oh, I want this enhance function to do the pop-up like at 2 seconds, or now I can change it to like 10 seconds, and so on and so forth. So now it's way more flexible. That way I also, again, the add mul props, like higher component might seem like an overkill, but then, sure, that's a Boolean state, but then I found other Boolean states all over my app, like, is this dropdown open? Is this button focused? And so I generalized my with state handlers to create something that's super generic that just creates really nice Boolean states with handlers really quickly. And then I just add it to my enhanced chain, and then I just keep going. So, you know, the more you generalize it, the more you can apply it in different scenarios. And it's, again, this is kind of like a technique that you shouldn't just do right away. It's more like, once you see 3, maybe think about it. So, cool. All right, let's talk about some other functions in Recompose. There's also this thing called with props. With props is also nice for just developing. So sometimes I just like to start off with my UI because I just want to see how pretty it is. And so I'm building it, great, but now I just need some props. With props, we'll just add those props and inject them. And so you can just keep on developing and with the desired props that you want. And when you're done with it, you can just take out the higher component and then it functions as you would expect, right? So that's a nice little developer tool. But also you can use with props in different ways. First, just a quick demo here that it does work. So even though user info needs a first name, last name, and an email, I can actually call it without any props, or the enhanced version without any props, and it will just work because I've injected the props. So here it is. Let me see. And here we can see at the bottom, the enhanced version I don't really give it any props. I just did it through my hierarchy component. Sweet. This is nice for developing, but you can also just use it in production code. So like, with props takes another argument instead of an object with the props that you want. It can take a function. And now, essentially, what you can do is, hey, based on these props, create these other props that I may need. So, for example, previously I had full name in my component, and like, that's not bad, but like, it's still logic in my presentational component. I just want to extract it out. So, one way I can do that is with props. I just essentially just calculate the full name like right before getting to my presentational component. This allows me. This is really nice because now I've extracted full name, so I can use it wherever I want in my other components all over the place, which is really awesome. I don't have to constantly like concatenate first name and last name. Also, presentational component is easier to test, right? Like I just pass full name, ready to go, and it just renders it just shows the prop that I give it. So that's really great. Cool. So let's also talk about just maximizing component reusability. React has taught us that pure components render the same UI given the same data. Cool. So yeah, you have data, I just want to render it. And given the same data, I should render the same thing. Cool. All right. If we want to render the same UI with new data, we could create a new component. Great, that makes sense. It's a little weird. Like, for example, if you have some different data structure and you want to render the same UI, like you could write another component that handles the specific data structure. That's one way you could go about it. Or you could basically massage the data to get it to just how you, to get it into the structure that your component expects it as. And then you can reuse the same component. And I think that's really great because we should be reusing our components as much as possible. Okay, but let's actually see this in code because that was kind of very mathy. So here we have our normal user info component. Still has our awesome add full name prop like hire component. And I threw in a sample usage in the very bottom. It literally expects the prop's first name, last name, email. And then for some weird reason, like some other endpoint gives you a user object, because that's how backend works. And so now, for some reason, you have to deal with this user object. It's not like, and the props that you want are within it. You have this nice little thing in Recompose called flattened props. So essentially, it will just, it'll grab the user object and we'll just grab the first name, last name, email, and just lift them up. So now, like our user info component gets user, first name, last name, and email. So great, we've actually just changed like the data to match our component essentially, and now we can just reuse the same component. And then here's another one, rename prop. Let's say it's kind of the same scenario, like great, we expect first name, last name, and email, but now we get this user object, and also let's just say like, oh, email within it is now email address for some reason, like they even changed the prop name on us. We can also do this one called rename prop, which just says like, okay, you have this prop, just change it, change its name so it still works essentially. So I'm just essentially just, before my component receives the data, I'm just changing it in such a way so that my component can use the data. Yeah, that's basically it. And doing so, I've been able to, I don't know, maximize the reusability of my components. Lastly, I just want to talk about some optimization hierarchy functions that are in Recompose, which I'm not going to get too much in depth, but it's nice to know they're there. Some people don't like to use Recompose because they're like, well, I really like the class version. You can do like class, component name, extends, pure component, right? Now you get a component that only re-renders if its props have actually changed. Recompose has a pure hierarchy component, and if you stick on a chain, now you essentially get the same thing. So that's really nice. Also, it has hyper optimization. So it also has one called only update for keys. Maybe there's only a certain set of props that you're wondering about. Or, for example, it's really weird, but like when you spread like an object into your component, even though your component only needs like 2 of the props, it still receives the other extraneous props. So sometimes you get re-renders on a prop that's not really relevant to the component, and that's really annoying. So maybe you just want to say like, no, I only want these props, like to change and re-render when these props change. So that's only update for keys, but even better, you get only update for prop types if you use prop types, which just says like, hey, re-render only the props in prop types change, which is the majority of our components. So that's a really sweet optimization. If you don't use prop types, you can use only update for keys. That's great. Also, we talked about with props. You can also do with props on change. So maybe you're doing a very expensive calculation and to create this new prop, and maybe it only depends on, to create this new prop, it only depends on one prop. You can say like, only if this prop changes, actually redo the calculation. Otherwise, use the memoized result. You can also give it a function. Sweet. All right, so overall summary. Cross-country concerns and components can be modularized via higher-order components. Awesome. And then small focused higher components can be combined to achieve complex behaviors and increase component reusability. Again, like we have a add props higher component that we use in various scenarios, but sometimes I need to add this other lifecycle higher component to get some other behavior. And that's really great. I can mix and match, create more complex things. And then finally, use Recompose to ease creation and usage of higher components. When like the first version of higher component, which I wrote that, I was like, I really hate writing this, and so that's another reason why I wouldn't do higher components unless I had Recompose, which just makes it super easy. I don't know, it makes me want to write more higher components. So, all right, finally some acknowledges. This talk was entirely inspired by Nick Graff's awesome talk at React Europe. Thanks And thanks Andrew Clark for creating Recompose as well. Thanks Intrepid and Accenture for giving me a job and salary and all that good stuff. And sending me to React Europe, where I got to meet like some really cool people. Like I love this community because the speakers are also very open. Like you can just go up to them and just ask them questions, and they're really excited. And finally, my team over at Intrepid Accenture, my director Ben Salter for his mentorship, and the rest of my team just for their support and help along the way. And review my crazy PRs when I told them I'm doing this, and then it's just like crazy code. Cool. All right, that is all. Thank you so much, guys.